When you come face to face with the diminutive figure of Charles Spencer Chaplin in London's Leicester Square, it's impossible to gaze upon the familiar little tramp with his baggy trousers, derby hat, oversized shoes and bendy cane without raising a smile. But in truth, if you didn't know he was here, you'd be hard-pressed to cross his path by accident, even though most people would agree that Charlie Chaplin, standing outside the best-loved cinemas in Britain, and perhaps even the world, is very fitting indeed. Yet there's a far more significant reason for the great man's presence here, at the heart of London's West End entertainment district. Charlie Chaplin, icon of world cinema, was in fact born just a short distance from where his statue stands today. His own story is truly a rags-to-riches tale, with as much tragic sentimentality as you'd expect to find in one of Chaplin's classic silent movies. The statue, by John Doubleday, was unveiled in 1981 on what would have been Charlie Chaplin's 92nd birthday if he'd lived to see it, and he certainly stands shoulder to shoulder with some august British greats. Leicester Square was laid out in 1670, where Leicester House, a now long-gone royal residence, once stood. The square was actually bought for the nation in 1874 by Baron Grant, who spent a colossal £30,000 in restoration and refurbishment. Today, you'll find 4 marble busts that he commissioned at each corner of the square, although they have suffered considerably from being continually open to the elements. Each is a hero of British history who lived in the district. Sir Joshua Reynolds, great portrait painter. Fellow artist William Hogarth. Sir Isaac Newton, scientist extraordinaire who famously watched an apple fall to deduce the laws of gravity. And John Hunter, a major pioneer of surgery who was certainly very famous in Baron Grant's day. Pride of place, however, at the centre of the square, astride a fine marble fountain, goes to the familiar figure of William Shakespeare, the greatest dramatist the world has ever known. This is an exact copy of the statue of the bard that graces Westminster Abbey, and undoubtedly Charlie Chaplin would have felt the irony of standing next to the most skilled exponent of comedy and tragedy to thrill the entertainment seekers of ages past. By the time Charlie Chaplin was born in 1889, several of London's most popular music halls had been established in Leicester Square. The music hall was a remarkably successful phenomenon that brought entertainment to the masses, and although extracts of more highbrow theatre, opera and ballet were often performed, they were mixed with the popular songs of the day. The Empire Cinema that you see today was once a music hall of the same name, on the same site, with the 1937 Art Deco Odeon replacing the Alhambra Music Hall, which would certainly have been familiar to the young Chaplin. It's interesting to note that the Leicester Square connection with the cinema dates back even further than the great auditoriums that you see before you. From 1790 onwards, panoramas were exhibited in a specially constructed circular building in Leicester Place, and you can still find the location if you know where to look. No longer an entertainment venue exactly, it's been the French church, Notre Dame de France, for many years, but continuing with the tradition of a circular shape. So for Charles Chaplin, the supreme entertainer of his day, a Leicester Square statue is the perfect tribute. In distance, there's a few short miles between this place and the streets where Charlie was born. But the gulf he crossed during his incredible lifetime was great indeed. And the true achievement of the ragged boy, brought up in a Kennington hovel, rising to be commemorated by a statue in Leicester Square, is truly the stuff of legend. When Charlie was once asked to talk about aspects of his life, he simply said that anything anyone wanted to know about him could be discovered from watching his films. In this programme, we'll be heeding Charlie's excellent advice, and not only will you get to see the streets where Chaplin once walked, but there'll also be extracts of his wonderfully evocative silent movies used throughout. To begin then at the beginning. Charles Spencer Chaplin was born on the 16th of April 1889, son of Charles and Hannah Chaplin, both of whom were music hall performers. There's no formal record of the great man's birth, as he was never registered. This is not particularly unusual, as at the time requirements to do so were not as stringent as they are today, and the most likely explanation is that his parents just never got around to it. When Charlie first found success in the world of cinema, he claimed to have been born in Fontainebleau, France, a far more glamorous location than Walworth, London, from whence he truly hailed. Whether this was a tale of his own making or his imaginative mother Hannah, we'll never know. But the truth of Charlie Chaplin's origins are now well documented. This is East Street, Walworth, where Charlie was born, although it's usually given in his biographies as East Lane. This road has been East Street since the mid-19th century, but previously the stretch between the Old Kent Road and Flint Street was always East Lane, where a market was regularly held throughout Charlie's childhood days. As is often the case in London, anywhere with a market tends to keep its old lane identity. Here you see the Petticoat Lane Market, famous the world over, despite the fact that this is not the official name for this particular road. Queen Victoria decreed that Petticoat was far too salacious, and promptly renamed the thoroughfare Middlesex Street. But she might as well not have bothered, because local folk carried on using Petticoat Lane, consigning Middlesex Street, technically speaking, to road signs and the A to Z. And besides, Middlesex Street Market just didn't have the same kind of resonance as Petticoat Lane. Returning to East Street, despite valiant attempts by various historians, it's been impossible to establish the number of the house where Charlie was born. However, as the property has by now undoubtedly been demolished due to the redevelopment of the district, the information would have been little help on this occasion. For Charles Chaplin Sr., young Charles was his first son, but this was not Hannah's first child. When the couple married, both giving their address as 57 Brandon Street, just off East Street, her baby son Sidney was just over 3 months old. There are some Victorian terraces still left on Brandon Street, but the Chaplin's abode is long gone. However, you do at least get an idea of what it would have looked like. In later years, when enthralling her boys with exotic tales of the past, Hannah claimed to have run off to South Africa as a young girl with a bookmaker by the name of Hawkes, to live the life of a gracious and privileged lady. Whether Hawkes was Sidney's father or not has never been proved, and there's no historical evidence to corroborate any such trip. Yet what we do know for sure is the date of Charlie's beloved older brother's birth, 16th of March 1885, because Sidney was actually registered and baptised. On both occasions, the records show that the father's name wasn't entered, but at 3 months old, Sidney took the name of Chaplin upon his mother's marriage. Charlie Chaplin's autobiography gives a wonderful insight into his early life, and he recalls the family moving to West Square when he was very young. These were indeed more affluent lodgings, and despite the continuous urban development of London, this elegant square has survived. Chaplin Sr. was quite successful at this time, but was already drinking heavily. Alcohol was crucial to the music halls. They'd grown up from the entertainment that used to be provided in the back rooms of pubs to increase liquor sales, and the demon drink was responsible for the ruin of many a music hall artist. By 1890, Charlie's father had made something of a name for himself, even crossing the Atlantic to entertain the good folk of New York. But his marriage to Hannah was already faltering, and by 1891 the census shows Charles Sr. living with music hall friends and Hannah residing with the 2 boys and her mother. In his autobiography, Charlie Chaplin describes the next period of his life as being quite comfortable. Memories of his mother going off to perform at the theatre after tucking the boys into bed, leaving them in the care of a housemaid, feature strongly, despite the fact that the absent Charles Sr. was not providing any financial contribution. The clue to such affluence may lie with Hannah giving birth to another baby boy on the 31st of August 1892, George Dryden Wheeler, fathered by the famous music hall entertainer of the same name, but better known by his stage name, Leo Dryden. Neither Sidney nor Charlie remember Leo Dryden as living with their mother, and when the liaison came to an abrupt end shortly after the child's birth, Hannah's new baby son disappeared from the Chaplin lives, leaving the boys with no recollection of their half-brother either. Leo Dryden snatched his 6-month-old son away from his doting mother Hannah in the spring of 1893, and the Chaplin family had no further contact with their lost blood relation for almost 30 years. The effect this must have had on Hannah Chaplin is almost too painful to contemplate, and the fact that her remaining son seemed untouched by the abduction and the extreme mental torment she must have been suffering is tribute indeed to Hannah's protective maternal instincts. For the next few years, Hannah did her best to support Sidney and Charlie, but life was continually cruel. Her own mother was ill and eventually ended up in the workhouse, an institution that truly was the end of the line for the poor and destitute, and very few ever recovered from the stigma of having to live in such a place. From the workhouse, the poor troubled woman was later certified insane and committed to a lunatic asylum. Again, Hannah protected the boys from the truth of the situation, and Charlie simply remembers his grandmother as a bright little old lady, with no knowledge of the poor, sad wretch she'd become by the time of her death. Hannah turned to religion for solace, attending here at Christ Church, Westminster Bridge Road, taking young Charlie with her. She earned whatever she could dressmaking and nursing for fellow members of the congregation, but it raised only a pittance, leaving the family very poor. Hannah also tried to resume her stage career, but without much success, as her voice, which had never been strong, was apt to fail her altogether. It was on just such an occasion that Charlie Chaplin made his first stage appearance in 1894. Hannah was stranded on stage one night, having lost her voice as she tried to sing, with Charlie watching from the wings in horror as his mother was booed, jeered and bombarded with missiles. In a flash, the entertaining little fellow, who could sing and dance beautifully, took to the stage to perform in his mother's place, and won the hearts of the hostile crowd in an instant. So it was that Charlie Chaplin's first ever public performance proved to be his mother's last. Despite the misfortune of poverty, Charlie felt rich indeed, basking in his own mother's love. She was a delicate, petite, refined soul who even in the most ghastly surroundings would perform her old music hall routines for her boys. And Charlie said in later years that if he had amounted to anything, it was all due to Hannah. Charlie Chaplin was just 6 years old when matters became even worse and he was parted from his beloved mother. Hannah was ill, and she was admitted to Lambeth Infirmary, adjoining the dreaded workhouse on Renfrew Road. Today, most of this Victorian-built institution has been demolished. But a closer look at Lambeth Hospital will reveal a few remaining architectural features that would have been familiar to Hannah Chaplin as she faced destitution walking through what was then the workhouse gates. Not only was young Charlie separated from Hannah, he also lost Sydney as well. The inner city workhouses often operated schools some distance out of town in what was then rural countryside. Sydney was sent to Norwood School, a poor law institution built to accommodate destitute children from Lambeth, while Charlie was sent to distant relations at York Road, close by Christchurch on Westminster Bridge Road. Although Hannah was to make a brief recovery, by the time Charlie was 7, she'd fallen into further decline and was readmitted to Lambeth Infirmary and Workhouse. This time, Charlie was sent to school with Sydney, but not before a wrangle between the District Relief Committee, Hannah, and Charles Chaplin Sr. Officials had been hunting for Charlie's father, who was, in their view, responsible for housing the 2 destitute boys. However, Hannah objected strongly, as by this time Charles Sr. was living with another woman. Mr. Chaplin was quick to point out that he was not actually Sydney's father, and a compromise was reached when he agreed to pay for the boys to attend Hanwell School, another poor law institution some 12 miles out of London. Charlie describes the journey to Hanwell as something of an adventure, but he must have been intimidated by the huge, imposing Victorian building when he reached his destination. Today, this is a community centre, but it still retains its awe-inspiring character, dating from 1850, when it was purpose-built for the orphans and destitute children of London's inner city. These schools were more commonly known as cuckoo schools, so named because of the bird's habit of leaving its young to be cared for in the nests of others. The road leading up to Hanwell has been renamed Cuckoo Avenue, a legacy of the building's original use. Charlie Chaplin's descriptions of life at Hanwell School are coloured by the harsh physical punishments dealt out to the boys, and in his case, quite unjustly, when he was beaten mercilessly for a misdemeanour he was not guilty of. Nevertheless, Sydney was close by, giving a modicum of comfort to ease such adversity. But sadly not for long, as being some years older, Sydney was transferred to a training ship called the Exmouth. Throughout 1897, Chaplin Sr. was pursued for non-payment of the agreed fees for the two boys, and eventually absolved himself of responsibility, although only temporarily, by insisting that Charlie and Sydney be discharged into the care of the now moderately recovered Hannah. This was the poorer side of London, immortalised in the great writings of Charles Dickens, who nudged the rich upper classes towards developing a social conscience, just half a century or so before Chaplin's birth. Such important, groundbreaking novels as Nicholas Nickleby and David Copperfield described perfectly the conditions that young Charlie Chaplin had to endure. It was a childhood that undoubtedly shaped his artistic genius, not only making his performances in later life tender and sympathetic, but also literally and metaphorically kicking bullying oppressors precisely where it hurt at every possible opportunity. There are many similarities shared by Dickens and Chaplin, way beyond overcoming the privations of a London slum childhood to achieve world fame. And when you look at the legacy of each, either on paper or celluloid, they both have much to teach about treating one's fellow man kindly in times of trouble, whatever his background or social class. However, there was no such comfort for the Chaplins back in Victorian Kennington, and from January 1898, Hannah, Charlie and Sydney moved from one backroom hovel to another, fighting for survival. By the 22nd of July, all hope was lost, and the family sadly made their way back to Lambeth Workhouse. On this occasion, Charlie and Sydney were sent to Norwood School, but within a fortnight they received something of a surprise. News came that their mother was discharging herself and the boys from the workhouse. Hannah greeted Charlie and Sydney at the workhouse gates, and the three spent a very happy day together in Kennington Park. Turned out to be a clever ruse on Hannah's part to spend some time with her sons, because they returned to the workhouse for tea time to be readmitted. The workhouse authorities were not best pleased, and either Hannah was very courageous in standing up to them, or already quite mentally disturbed and losing her reason. Next day, Sydney and Charlie were sent back to Norwood, and just 3 weeks after the day out in Kennington Park, Hannah was committed to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum, confined to a padded cell because of her distressed, irrational state. The name of Chaplin was now very familiar to the board of Lambeth Workhouse Guardians. Enough was enough, and Chaplin Senior was once again sought. A fortnight after Hannah's committal to the asylum, Charlie and Sidney were taken from school and delivered to 287 Kennington Road, where Chaplin Senior resided, complete with sullen mistress and a 4-year-old son. There's a plaque commemorating Charlie Chaplin's time here in Kennington Road, but fortunately for all concerned, it was a very brief tenure. Louise, Chaplin Senior's mistress, was also a heavy drinker, and she took a particular dislike to Sidney, making life very difficult. Although Chaplin Senior could be charming with his boys when the mood took him, it was his vitriolic and violent altercations with Louise that shaped young Charlie's memories. Within 2 months, Hannah had recovered her reason sufficiently to be discharged from the asylum and reunited with her boys, took a room at 39 Methley Street. It was hardly a luxurious abode, next to the local slaughterhouse and a pickle factory, but all parties were relieved at the arrangement. Chaplin Senior even made the occasional contribution towards Charlie and Sidney's upkeep, presumably to avoid further disruptions with Louise and his volatile domestic arrangements. Hannah worked at her sewing, and Sidney found a job as a telegraph boy, which did, at the very least, prevent a return to the workhouse. There was an odd mix of sentimentality and harsh reality in this late 19th century poverty-stricken London existence. In later years, this was to become an intrinsic part of Charlie Chaplin's character, as comedy tinged with tragedy evolved as his inimitable trademark. Then, late in 1898, young street urchin Charlie Chaplin once again took to the music hall stage, after being spotted by William Jackson, founder of a clog dancing troupe known as the 8 Lancashire Lads. Clog dancing was very popular in the industrial north of England, where thousands of factory workers wore heavy wooden shoes, known as clogs, to protect their feet. This is actually the last remaining English clog factory, but there's little call for these clumsy shoes today. Dancing in clogs was highly entertaining and funny to watch, but by all accounts 10-year-old Charlie was a natural. The troupe toured music halls all over the country, and Charlie was even selected to play a cat in the Christmas pantomime at the London Hippodrome. In his autobiography, Charlie explains his departure from the Lancashire Lads as being due to Hannah's concerns about his welfare, as she constantly complained that her son looked unwell. In point of fact, although the work was hard, Jackson and his wife did their best to look after the boys, and certainly in later years Charlie expressed a fondness and gratitude for this early grounding in comic entertainment. Life back with Hannah was a little more financially secure, as Sidney had gone to work at sea thanks to the qualifications he'd picked up aboard the training ship he'd been sent to from Hanwell School. Sadly, though, for Charlie, this also meant that Sidney was away for long periods of time. On the 9th of May, 1901, Charles Chaplin Senior lost the battle for life at the age of 37, the cause of death being cirrhosis of the liver and dropsy. The last time Charlie saw his father alive was here in the snug bar of the Three Stags pub on the Kennington Road, where he was in a very sorry state. It was around this time that Charlie and Hannah, joined by Sydney when he was on leave, moved to 3 Pownall Terrace, which was demolished in the 1960s, although it's possible to work out roughly where the grim little row of houses stood. The Chaplin's tiny top-floor rooms, in what was then a 3-storey brick-built tenement off Kennington Road, virtually opposite the house where Chaplin Sr. had lived, meant a great deal to Charlie, who often nostalgically revisited on his return trips to London. Young Charlie did his best to make money, doing all kinds of odd jobs, but by 1903, Hannah's health started to falter again. Sydney and his wage packet were delayed at sea, and the financial pressures were building. When Charlie returned one day to find a crowd of excited children on the doorstep, he was horrified to hear that his mother had gone mad. Charlie led her back to Lambeth Infirmary with a heavy heart, and when his own welfare was discussed by well-meaning officials, he quickly escaped, saying that he'd stay with an aunt. There was no way he wanted to be returned to Norwood or Hanwell School, but it was hard for him to manage alone until Sydney eventually returned. Hannah was readmitted to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum, which was 20 miles outside London at Coulsdon in Surrey. It actually remained in use as a mental hospital until the 1990s, but this magnificent Victorian building is now disused and has fallen into a poor state of repair. The distance from London meant that even after Sydney's homecoming, the boys could rarely visit Hannah, who was very ill and would never fully regain her mental faculties. The two Chaplin brothers were both driven by ambitions to become performers, and Charlie won a role in a touring play of Sherlock Holmes. After a successful run, Charlie was even able to procure a role for Sydney, and the brothers were able to work together. A few years later, Sydney was to return the compliment after finding work with Fred Carno, a colourful music hall performer and manager known as the Governor by his famous speechless comedians. In 1908, Carno gave Charlie a 2-week trial, and evidently he was satisfactory, as he was given a contract, fully justifying Sydney's recommendation. More affluent than they'd ever been in their lives, the Chaplin boys took a fine flat on the Brixton Road, which they furnished in style from a nearby second-hand shop. The tide had turned, and in the early years of the 20th century, the future for Charles Chaplin was getting better by the day. He encountered the first love of his life, a beautiful young dancer called Hetty Kelly, who appeared on the same bill as him at the Streatham Empire. Hetty was 15, Charlie 19, and completely smitten. They arranged to meet at Kennington Gate near the park, where he'd spent such a special day with Hannah and Sydney when they'd escaped from the workhouse some years earlier. Charlie bombarded her with talk of love, although she was completely bemused, and the strange little romance only lasted 11 days. Yet Hetty's legacy was quite remarkable, as the wistful face of a beautiful young girl always characterised Charlie Chaplin's films, not to mention his personal life in the years ahead. As well as playing the British theatres, Carno also sent a company of players on an annual American tour, and in 1910 Charlie was selected to go. Accompanying him was a real Lancashire lad by the name of Stan Jefferson, who was also to become a star of the silent screen as Stan Laurel. The company arrived in New York, where they were to open on the 3rd of October, and, much to Charlie's surprise, they were very well received. Chaplin had felt the sketch Carno had insisted he perform was not ideal for an American audience, and when he voiced his concerns, he was told in no uncertain terms to do as he was directed. Music hall, or vaudeville as it was often known, was very popular in the United States, and whatever the peculiarities of an English touring company, Charlie Chaplin's errant and hilarious drunk character lost nothing in any translation. After 21 months in America, Charlie reluctantly returned to England in June 1912. But he instinctively knew that the US of A was going to be his land of opportunity. Depressingly, Hannah was still not recovered in Cane Hill Asylum. But at least Charlie and Sydney could now afford to have her transferred to a private nursing home. While Charlie had been away, Sydney had married, and the brothers' little bachelor flat had gone forever. So it was that when Charlie boarded ship on the 2nd of October 1912, America bound, he knew that his destiny lay many miles across the Atlantic, far from London and his childhood memories. How Charlie must have smiled as he read the words at the base of the Statue of Liberty as he reached New York. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. Here he had the opportunity to be whoever he wanted to be. The poverty of the London slums could be forgotten, and Charlie Chaplin had come to America for good. Or so he thought. Charlie Chaplin travelled the touring circuit from the Atlantic to the Pacific. New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, to mention just a few of his destinations, until, in true Hollywood style, his lovable comic drunk was spotted by a man from the movies. The film industry was in its infancy, but was literally growing in popularity by the day. Mack Sennett, the mastermind behind the Keystone Film Company, invited Charlie to join him for more money each week than Charlie had ever dared dream of earning. Honourably, Charlie insisted on seeing out his contract with Carno before departing for Los Angeles in December 1913 to meet Mack Sennett on the Keystone set. Filmmaking in such pioneering times was all about improvisation, which suited Charlie very well, as he'd always been keen to use his own ideas. His first film, which can still be viewed to this day, was called Making a Living. But the director, Henry Lerman, wasn't any too keen on Charlie's input. The character Charlie plays has a top hat, cravat, monocle and long drooping villainous moustache. And Charlie really hated the finished film, because all of his clever jokes and improvisations ended up on the cutting room floor. It's been suggested that even Max Sennett questioned the abilities of his new signing after this first offering. But just a week later, Charlie's Kids Auto Races was released on the 7th of February 1914, and the little tramp character that was to be Charlie's trademark for the rest of his life made his first appearance on the silver screen. The trousers were huge and baggy, and the enormous oversized shoes were worn on the wrong feet so that they'd stay on. A tiny jacket, by contrast, was far too small, and the derby hat, again inadequate in size, looked very bizarre perched on top of Charlie's curly dark hair. The finishing touch of a toothbrush moustache, cut down so that the viewers could see Charlie's full range of facial expressions, completed the picture, with the simple addition of a wigger-wagger cane. In later years, Charlie said that the costume led the way for the character's development from the moment he put it all together, and by the time he'd walked from wardrobe to the film set, the little tramp had been born. Whatever doubts had been expressed about the quirky little Englishman evaporated as Charlie Chaplin changed the face of cinema history. Film after film appeared as the Keystone production line ran at a phenomenal pace. Yet Charlie Chaplin was not satisfied. He needed to call his own shots, and for anyone asked to direct the little tramp, it was no easy task. Max Sennett even asked the lovely Keystone actress Mabel Normand, who Charlie got on with very well, to try directing him. It was an unmitigated disaster and could have caused Charlie all sorts of problems, as Mac and Mabel were romantically involved, and Mabel was affronted by Charlie's refusal to do her bidding. All at the studio thought Chaplin's Keystone days would come to an abrupt end, but unbeknown to anyone else, orders were coming through for more Chaplin films, because all across the USA, sales were booming. Mac was far too shrewd to lose Charlie over the tiff with Mabel, and when Chaplin offered his savings to guarantee the next film if Sennett allowed him to direct himself, the problem of who should direct The Little Tramp was solved. Apart from Tilly's Punctured Romance, which was directed by Max Sennett and released in November 1914 as the first feature-length comedy, Charlie was at last in artistic charge of his own work. The public adored Charlie Chaplin films, and the Keystone studio went from strength to strength. In all, Chaplin made an astonishing 35 films throughout 1914 for Max Sennett, and the financial rewards were immense. Charlie soon persuaded Mac to employ Sidney Chaplin, and by the end of the year the brothers were once again reunited, but this time in the USA. Charlie Chaplin's confidence grew to new heights, and he was well aware of his value at the box office. He was able to command the then astronomical fee of $1,000 a week, and in 1915 an even greater financial inducement took him to S&A Films in Chicago. Leaving Keystone behind was one thing, but leaving Los Angeles was quite another. And after 2 films, he moved the whole operation to the S&A studios in California. Success followed success. The Tramp and The Champion were just 2 of the 14 films he was to make in his year with S&A. It's interesting to note that Chaplin had to find his own leading lady, and he chose an unknown young secretary to groom for stardom. Edna Purviance's wistful blonde looks complemented Charlie's dark soulfulness perfectly, and even after her film career had petered out, she remained on the Chaplin payroll for the rest of her life. S&A appreciated Charlie's value, and towards the end of his year-long contract offered a staggering $5,000 a week to renew it. However, Sidney's sound business sense prevailed, and despite Charlie's understandable delight at such an enormous pay rise, his brother negotiated a $10,000 a week salary with a $150,000 bonus with Mutual Films. How could Charlie refuse? He was just 27 years old and was the highest paid celebrity the world had ever known. Mutual Films also offered Charlie a less frenetic pace of working, allowing him the luxury of creating 1 film a month with complete artistic freedom. The films were better than ever, with The Vagabond, Easy Street and The Immigrant being just 3 examples of his fine work from this period, with Edna Purviance still appearing as Charlie's leading lady. As the mutual film contract came to an end, Charlie was inundated with offers, not least of which were Mutual's own improved terms. And then it came, the $1 million contract. An unprecedented sum of money for any artist. The company was First National, and they signed Charlie Chaplin to make 8 films of any length of his choosing over the next 18 months. It was also time for Charlie to exert even greater artistic independence by creating his own studios. And although the buildings were bathed daily in the bright Californian sunshine, he managed to create a quite remarkable working environment that looked and felt just like an old English village. The London street urchin had reached the top of his profession, exceeding his own wildest dreams, and now he had the whole world at his feet. Whether he was a happy man, with his newfound fame and fortune, however, is impossible to answer. Ironically, Charlie's success made him a very eligible bachelor, which, in point of fact, ended up costing him dear. In 1918, Charlie met the beautiful 16-year-old actress Mildred Harris. Perhaps she reminded him of his lovely Hetty from all those years ago back in London. But whatever the attraction, the insignificant film extra became romantically involved with the mighty Charlie Chaplin. When she announced that as a result she was pregnant, Mildred's streetwise mother took charge, and Chaplin had no alternative but to marry the poor girl to avoid a scandal. But the couple had nothing in common, and as the mother-in-law moved into the marital home too, the liaison was doomed from the start, with matters made even worse when the pregnancy turned out to be a false alarm. Charlie Chaplin, as ever, despite his domestic troubles, worked tirelessly, and the little tramp grew more famous than ever. By the time The Kid was in the final stages of production in 1920, his marriage had been played out. A chase as dramatic as any Keystone escapade saw Charlie flee across the USA with his embryonic movie as Mildred's divorce lawyers attempted to seize it. Although The Kid was saved, the divorce settlement cost Charlie a fortune, and his good name was sullied by the consequent newspaper reports. Douglas Fairbanks and his tiny Hollywood sweetheart Mary Pickford were huge movie stars who moved in the same firmament as Charlie, and the three were lifelong friends. In 1919, with D.W. Griffith, another great from the early movie days, all four got together and formed United Artists, even though Charlie was not to be free of his First National contract until 1923. With Sydney in America at Charlie's side, the two brothers had looked forward to the day when they could bring their mother Hannah to join them. They were finally reunited in March 1921, and she also had a chance to meet her long-lost son, snatched from her as a 6-month-old baby, who now, an actor by the name of Wheeler Dryden, often worked with his two Chaplin brothers. It It was certainly a year for nostalgia, as Charlie also returned to his humble Kennington roots, taking a brief detour on a European trip to take a stroll down memory lane. Nothing, though, could have prepared Charlie for the welcome he was to receive at Waterloo Station, as thousands thronged to meet his train. This was the power of celebrity, and as Charlie Chaplin made his way to his hotel, the route was lined with fans hoping to catch a glimpse of their idol in scenes reminiscent of great royal occasions. By the time Charlie was free to work with United Artists, life seemed to be entering a more settled stage. But trouble was again just around the corner. His name was linked romantically with many glamorous actresses, although Charlie seemed to avoid marrying any of them, until he started work on The Gold Rush, when he was captivated by the very young and lovely Lita Grey. Evidently he'd learnt nothing from his experiences with Mildred, because again Charlie found himself with a domineering prospective mother-in-law, forcing him into marriage with a pregnant bride, who was little more than a child herself. Charlie says nothing about the second Mrs. Chaplin in his autobiography, out of respect for the two much-loved sons, Charles and Sidney, which their union produced. But, needless to say, the marriage was doomed, and once more Charlie's name was dragged through the courts as an acrimonious and expensive divorce was settled. Hardly a year later, Hannah Chaplin died on the 28th of August, 1928, at her California home, never fully aware of her son's great success. Once, whilst watching The Little Tramp on the film set, she insisted that she must buy him a new suit. No matter how hard Charlie tried, he couldn't get her to understand that he was just acting. Perhaps a sad legacy of all her years in mental institutions, as she still tried to do her very best for her beloved boy.
Hello, Dan. How are you, John? Where you been hiding out? Sit down. Tell me all about yourself.
Well, ain't nothing much to tell, son. Been doing some repair work around the place. Kind of expected you out.
Well, I was figuring on getting out tomorrow night. Thought I'd try and even up that cribbage score.
Come ahead. I've got to run over to King City tomorrow, but I'll be back for dinner.
Hollywood was changing dramatically with the advent of the talkies, and film characters were now able to speak. Chaplin felt instinctively that if the Little Tramp spoke, the magic would be lost forever. So he resisted the new development, and when his next film, City Lights, was released, it was certainly a success. After travelling to New York for the opening of City Lights, Charlie then went on to London to see the film premiered in Britain. It was 10 years since Charlie had last visited his homeland, and he was certainly excited by the prospect, if filled with a little trepidation. He need not have worried. The public were as eager to catch a glimpse of him as they had been in 1921. And it was altogether more pleasant for Charlie, as the authorities had expected the crowds to greet him at Paddington Station, and matters were a lot better organised. The London opening of City Lights was a success, which was especially pleasing to Charlie, as he'd expected the torrential rain to keep the audience at home. And with such great British dignitaries as Winston Churchill and George Bernard Shaw present, The little tramp must have felt very honoured indeed. When Charlie had first come back to London, there were a number of things that he wanted to do, but found the prospect quite emotionally daunting. Some of his darkest, loneliest hours had been spent at the workhouse school at Hanwell. But on this second trip, he decided to return in the hope of laying a few of his ghosts. The wonderful welcome he received at his old school moved Charlie to tears as he entertained the children with his comic antics. Charlie was especially delighted to find happy, well-cared-for youngsters, and was comforted to think that they would never know the privations that he'd faced as a child. Charlie also wanted to travel north to find the places where he'd toured as a young actor in the play Sherlock Holmes all those years before. He remembered Manchester as a warm, inviting, romantic sort of place, but the realities were very different when he arrived to empty streets on a dull Sunday afternoon. Charlie realised that it was most probably the generous spirit of the Lancashire folk that had been responsible for making him feel so happy while he was staying there. And as there was not a human to be seen anywhere, he promptly travelled on. An interesting detour, though, on the way to Manchester gives a fascinating insight into Charlie Chaplin's character. As a thespian, Charlie was certainly familiar with the great bard of Avon, William Shakespeare, and en route northwards he decided to stop at Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon. Should you ever find yourself in Stratford today, you can visit the black and white house where Shakespeare was born, the lovely thatched cottage that belonged to his wife, Anne Hathaway's family, and his mother, Mary Arden's home. They're fine, simple country dwellings, and although visited by many thousands of tourists today, they were humble properties indeed when Shakespeare was a lad. Now, over the centuries, there have been a number of well-respected literary critics who have cast doubt upon Shakespeare's claim to have written his very famous words, the argument being that a poor, uneducated ploughboy from Stratford couldn't possibly have been responsible for penning the greatest dramas the world has ever known. After visiting Shakespeare's birthplace, Charlie Chaplin shared this opinion, pronouncing that no genius could ever have dwelt or had its beginnings in such a place. It's ironic that Charlie Chaplin, who, it has to be said, originated from an even poorer background than William Shakespeare, disbelieved the man's ability to rise so far above his station in life, when it was precisely what he'd done himself. But no doubt it would make Charlie smile to find himself commemorated with a statue right next to William Shakespeare in Leicester Square. Both men had enjoyed a meteoric rise to fame, finding greatness through remarkable talent, yet perhaps Charlie's reluctance to accept Shakespeare's rightful celebrity came from the fact that he still carried a deep-seated insecurity about his own. Chaplin arrived back in Hollywood after more than a year's travelling in June 1932, but found life rather lonely in his beautiful house on Summit Drive. but meeting the actress Paulette Goddard just a month later changed matters considerably. Although every effort was made to keep matters private, the fact that the couple eventually married was well known. It wasn't a lasting success. Paulette divorced Charlie in 1942, but they did have a lot in common, and there seems to have been genuine affection on both sides. Also, Charlie's two sons from his marriage with Lita were very fond of their stepmother, and the third Mrs. Chaplin cared a great deal for them. Paulette appeared with Charlie in Modern Times, again a silent picture, and once more Chaplin surprised the critics, achieving another success without using sound. But the writing was on the wall. Charlie was going to have to move with the times. So in 1940 he screened his first talkie, and it was a film that nobody could have anticipated. Adolf Hitler had fascinated Charlie, not least because the two were born just days apart, and it's hard to believe that two men so close in age should have become world famous, but in completely different ways. They do say that Hitler fashioned his moustache after Charlie's, in the hope of emulating his popularity. So it's appropriate that the great dictator saw Charlie imitating Hitler. A comic parody with a serious message for the world, the film grossed more at the box office than any of Charlie's previous efforts. Unwittingly, Charlie had dipped a toe into the world of politics, and when he was asked to speak at a rally on military matters, he gave a speech that caused offence to the American authorities, who saw his viewpoint as distinctly communist, in a climate that was rife with paranoia about anyone with socialist tendencies. Charlie Chaplin may have been one of the richest and most famous men in the world, but he had never forgotten his poverty-stricken roots, and he was never afraid to speak his mind. Unfortunately, this was the start of a chapter of events that was to seriously damage Charlie Chaplin's popularity in America, with factions of the powers that be hounding him at every possible opportunity. However, despite this being one of the most difficult periods of Charlie's life, he was also blessed with a piece of good fortune that was to sustain his spirit for the rest of his life. Charlie was casting for a new film, and he was introduced to a young actress whose father was the famous playwright Eugene O'Neill. Despite her tender 18 years, Una O'Neill was a dark-haired, delicate beauty with a calmness and serenity that captivated Charlie completely. When they married in 1943, at 18, Una was the same age as Charlie's eldest son. Chaplin himself was 54. Unlike her three predecessors, Una proved to be more interested in her husband's career than she was in her own, and her unique devotion to Charlie and his to her brought a newfound peace to both their lives. Friends commented that Una would read out loud for Charlie from Trilby, a classic Victorian novel by George du Maurier that was a particular favourite of his. Chaplin had often been accused of being a Svengali, the villainous character made famous by the book for grooming a young naive girl for stardom with tragic consequences. But the fact that Charlie's new young wife shared the reading of Trilby with her husband evidently proved she had nothing to fear from any Svengali tendencies, whatever might have happened in Charlie's past relationships. The age difference in itself might well have proved to be a difficulty, but a sordid paternity suit against Charlie, fueled by the authorities already out to prove Chaplin to be anti-American, gave the couple far bigger issues to deal with in the early years of their marriage. Yet theirs was true contentment, and nothing that the outside world threw at them could spoil their happiness. The Chaplin family grew at a steady rate, as 8 children were born in total, with the youngest arriving when Charlie was 73 years old. However, as the 1940s and 50s progressed, America decided that it was high time for the Englishman responsible for giving the world the little tramp to go. Charlie had never applied for citizenship of his adopted country, and when he decided to take his wife and family to visit his childhood haunts in London, his persecutors had the perfect opportunity to be rid of him. As the Statue of Liberty disappeared into the distance, Charlie was told that his re-entry permit had been cancelled, and he would have to undergo a thorough investigation into his politics and his morality if he ever darkened US shores again. If America didn't want Charlie Chaplin, then he certainly didn't want to be there. But the pain of such a forced exile from a country that he'd come to regard as home must have been devastating. Una gave up her own American citizenship, and the Chaplin family settled in Switzerland. It was a peaceful, contented existence, and Charlie was undoubtedly a happy man, enjoying his beautiful Swiss house and his ever-growing young family. Simple pleasures meant everything, and although they could have holidayed in the most exclusive locations in Europe, an annual Easter visit to Ireland was always a great family favourite. For Charlie and Una, so long as they were in each other's company, surrounded by their children, the outside world could trouble them little. There's an interesting facet of Charlie Chaplin's character that manifested itself, and not for the first time, just before boarding ship to sail for England in 1952. Whether Charlie was edgy because of the persecution he'd experienced at the hands of the anti-communist witch hunts leading up to his departure, it's hard to say. But he seems to have had almost a premonition that trouble was about to befall him. Charlie had, for some time, wanted Una to have access to his safety deposit boxes at the bank, in case anything should happen to him, but they'd never got round to signing the relevant papers. On the day before travelling, Charlie had suddenly insisted that they do so, just 10 minutes before the bank closed. If it was a psychic phenomenon that guided Charlie's actions, it was fortuitous indeed, and meant that Una was able to release Charlie's fortune without difficulty. Had the papers not have been signed that day, who knows what problems the Chaplins might have experienced in releasing their assets from exile in Switzerland. Charlie's autobiography was published in 1964, and in it he speaks of other occasions when he felt his actions were guided by forces he could not explain, and one incident is more significant than even Charlie could have known when he first told the story. As a small boy, out and about on his travels one day, Charlie suddenly felt very thirsty. He stopped at a familiar pub and asked the amiable proprietor for a glass of water. But when the water arrived, Charlie was overwhelmed by an instinct not to drink it, and he made a speedy exit without touching a drop. Just 2 weeks later, the man who'd kindly offered refreshment was arrested for poisoning 5 women, and the last of his victims was actually dying in the room above the bar on the day that Charlie had been given his glass of water. What Chaplin was unaware of was the fact that the murderer, George Chapman, was one of the major suspects in the Jack the Ripper murders, which took place in Whitechapel, just a stone's throw from Kennington, the year before Charlie was born. The climate of fear created by such a set of events lasted for years, particularly as the culprit was never caught. But when there was a resurgence of interest in the case in the 1970s, some time after Chaplin's recollection of the incident, George Chapman emerged as a major suspect in the Ripper murders. Before taking up a career as a pub landlord back in the 1880s, Chapman had been a surgeon barber in premises beneath the White Hart pub here in Whitechapel. The body of the first Ripper victim was found just outside, in the George Yard building, directly behind the pub. It's possible that as a youngster in Lambeth Workhouse, Charlie had heard gossip about the moustached publican, because the second Ripper victim had actually been an inmate of the workhouse, and stories would have undoubtedly have still been told about her grisly end, perhaps at the hands of George Chapman. Therefore, Charlie's psychic sense of foreboding might well have been based on genuine fear of a notorious local villain. What we do know for certain, however, is the fact that Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the most important policemen in the Ripper case, when he heard of Chapman's arrest, said, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Chapman was hanged for his murderous poisoning activities, but to this day the Ripper case remains unsolved, and no one can say whether or not Charlie Chaplin actually came face to face with Jack the Ripper, psychically sensing that he was in the presence of danger. But young Charlie's heightened sense of self-preservation could have been fortunate indeed, not only for himself, but for the future of the film industry as well. With so many films made with the Little Tramp as the main character, it's fascinating to look at examples of Charlie's later work, where he takes on a different persona, making the atmosphere quite different to his earlier films. Yet the themes of comedy through tragedy are still never very far away. Limelight was completed before he left for England in 1952, which is ironically where his inspiration for the film came from. Charlie recalled the old music halls of his youth, and the beautiful heroine is a dancer who fears she's lost the use of her legs, perhaps as tragic as a singer losing her voice, echoing Hannah Chaplin's demise all those years earlier. Charlie was able to watch his masterpiece premiere in London, but on the far side of the Atlantic he had to leave the film to the mercies of his American tormentors, who did everything within their power to prevent Limelight being screened. Having successfully rid themselves of Chaplin, targeting his work was an opportunity to add insult to injury. The final years passed quickly, and America finally made peace with Charlie, when he was invited back in 1972 to receive a special Oscar in recognition of his incalculable services to the movie industry. Another Oscar followed in 1973 for the Best Original Dramatic Score for Limelight. Although the film had first appeared in 1952, because the American authorities had successfully blocked it being seen in Los Angeles at that time, it was not shown in an LA theatre until 1972, and by Academy rules, this made Limelight eligible for consideration. Britain, country of his birth, also honoured him with a knighthood in 1975. Sir Charles Chaplin certainly had a ring to it, and you can't help wondering what his mother Hannah would have made of such a grand title for her son Charlie. Such rewards were perhaps a little late in coming, because on Christmas Day 1977, Charlie died, perfectly peacefully, at his home in Switzerland with Una, the children and grandchildren all around. Surprisingly, Charlie Chaplin didn't particularly like Christmas, despite the fact that he went to great efforts to make it special for his family. He certainly had no happy childhood memories of the season, remembering only being given an orange at Christmas when he was at the workhouse school back at Hanwell. The vibrant colour struck him indelibly against the dark, dour surroundings of the erstwhile institution, and it was an image that evidently never ceased to haunt him. Nevertheless, Charlie Chaplin's passing, albeit on Christmas Day, would have been exactly as he would have wished, and at his own request, the funeral was a private family occasion. Lady Chaplin felt the loss of Charlie deeply, and her remaining years were spent quietly until her own death from cancer in 1991. They're buried side by side in the churchyard at Corsier in Switzerland, close to the home where they spent so many happy years. Yet the Chaplin legacy lives on forever in the films that have been left behind, bringing the gift of laughter to viewers of every generation, past, present and future. No language barrier exists to date or limit people's understanding of his work, and when you learn a little more about the man responsible for creating the lovable tramp's persona, you'll find yourself appreciating the undisputed king of silent comedy all the more. But perhaps our last thoughts on Charlie Chaplin should come from the closing lines of Trilby, words he knew and loved so well that completely and simply sum up his life and work. A little work, a little play, to keep us going, and so good day. A little warmth, a little light, of love's bestowing, and so good night. A little fun to match the sorrow of each day's growing, and so good morrow. A little trust, that when we die, we reap our sowing, and so goodbye.